When prayer becomes a daily posture rather than an occasional activity, it sets in motion a spiritual rhythm that leads to inevitable breakthrough. Consistency in approaching God with faith and expectation transforms the believer's life from reactive to receptive. Breakthrough is not always immediate or dramatic, but it becomes certain for those who remain committed to daily communion. Each prayer offered builds momentum, aligning the heart, mind, and spirit with God's timing and purposes. Daily prayer cultivates a posture of expectancy. The believer begins to anticipate God's guidance, protection, and provision in every aspect of life. This expectancy is not wishful thinking. It is rooted in relationship. As prayer becomes habitual, faith grows stronger because the believer experiences God's faithfulness repeatedly, even in small ways. These experiences accumulate, reinforcing trust and confidence that God is actively working, even when results are not yet visible. Breakthrough often begins internally before it manifests externally. Through daily prayer, the heart is strengthened, fears are subdued, and patience is cultivated. The believer learns to wait without anxiety and to trust without constant reassurance. This inner transformation is critical for breakthroughs that arrive in hearts prepared by prayer are far more enduring than those granted solely by circumstance. Prayer shapes the character necessary to sustain the blessings it brings. Daily prayer also sharpens discernment. When believers are consistent in seeking God's wisdom, they begin to recognize subtle opportunities, shifts in circumstances, and guidance that might otherwise go unnoticed. This discernment allows them to make decisions in alignment with God's will, positioning them to receive breakthrough at the right time. It is not simply a matter of asking, it is a matter of listening, obeying, and moving with intentionality. When guidance becomes clear, faith expressed through daily prayer strengthens resilience. Life inevitably presents trials and opposition, but those who maintain consistent prayer are better equipped to endure challenges without losing hope. Breakthroughs often come after seasons of persistence, and daily prayer builds the endurance necessary to sustain that waiting period. The believer learns that spiritual momentum is more powerful than immediate gratification, and that faithfulness in prayer is rewarded with outcomes that are purposeful and lasting. Finally, daily prayer invites divine alignment. When the believer's life is consistently submitted through prayer, God's plans unfold in ways that are strategic, timely, and precise. Breakthroughs occur not by coincidence, but by design, reflecting God's perfect understanding of timing, preparation, and capacity. Each prayer positions the believer to receive what has already been ordained, ensuring that answers, opportunities, and blessings arrive when hearts are ready and circumstances are ripe. Through this daily discipline, prayer ceases to be merely a habit. It becomes a transformative posture that guarantees spiritual, emotional, and even practical breakthrough. Consistency in prayer is what transforms faith from a momentary experience into a sustaining power. While emotional intensity can ignite passion, it is consistency that builds endurance and spiritual strength. Many believers pray fervently in moments of crisis, yet drift when life appears calm. However, it is the daily, steady return to prayer that establishes a firm spiritual foundation. Consistency signals devotion not driven by circumstance, but by commitment. When prayer becomes consistent, it creates spiritual rhythm. Just as the body functions best with routine, the soul thrives when it regularly reconnects with its source. Daily prayer trains the heart to remain sensitive to God's voice, even amid distractions. Over time, discernment sharpens and spiritual awareness deepens. Consistency opens the door to understanding God's guidance, not as rare interruptions, but as a continual presence woven into daily life. One of the greatest misconceptions about prayer is that it must always feel powerful to be effective. In truth, some of the most transformative prayers are quiet, ordinary, and even weary. Consistency means showing up even when emotions are absent, when words feel limited, and when faith feels small. These prayers are not overlooked, they are honored. God responds to faithfulness long before he responds to intensity. The act of returning daily, regardless of feeling, builds spiritual authority. Consistency in prayer also dismantles fear and doubt gradually. Breakthrough is rarely a single dramatic moment. It is often the result of repeated alignment over time. Each prayer becomes a brick laid in a spiritual foundation. Individually, they may seem small, but together they construct resilience. When challenges arise, the believer who has been consistent in prayer does not panic easily because their trust has been reinforced through repetition. Daily prayer opens doors that sudden passion alone cannot. Passion may inspire action, but consistency sustains it. In consistent prayer, God shapes patience, humility, and obedience. The believer learns to wait without frustration and to trust without constant reassurance. Over time, prayer shifts from seeking proof to walking in confidence. Doors begin to open, not always visibly, but spiritually, as alignment produces readiness. Consistency also builds intimacy. Relationships grow not through rare grand gestures, but through continual presence. Daily prayer deepens familiarity with God's character and faithfulness. The believer becomes more aware of divine timing, recognizing that God's answers often unfold progressively. Consistent prayer keeps the heart open, receptive, and expectant. In this steady devotion, spiritual power is unlocked. Not the kind that seeks attention, but the kind that produces peace, wisdom, and unshakable faith. Consistency in prayer does not force God's hand. It positions the believer to receive what God has already prepared. There are moments in the life of faith when prayers seem to rise upward but return without visible answers. These moments can feel heavy, confusing, and even discouraging, yet what appears as unanswered is never unnoticed. Every prayer carries purpose, even when the response is delayed or different from what was expected. God does not discard sincere prayers. He weaves them into a larger process that often unfolds beyond immediate understanding. Unanswered prayers often challenge trust, but they also deepen it. In seasons of waiting, faith is stretched from dependence on outcomes to reliance on character. God uses delay to shift the believer's focus from what is desired to who he is. When answers are postponed, it is not because God is absent, but because he is working beneath the surface. Growth is taking place in areas unseen, strengthening patience, humility, and endurance. Sometimes prayers go unanswered because God is protecting rather than withholding. What feels like denial may actually be divine wisdom intervening on behalf of a future not yet visible. God sees the full picture, including consequences, timing, and readiness. In these moments, prayer becomes less about control and more about trust. The believer learns to surrender outcomes while remaining faithful in devotion. Unanswered prayers also shape character in profound ways. They teach perseverance when hope feels fragile. They refine motives, revealing whether faith is anchored in expectation or obedience. In waiting, the believer is invited to mature spiritually, learning to stand firm without constant reassurance. This process builds a faith that is not easily shaken by uncertainty or delay. There is also purpose in how unanswered prayers align the heart with God's timing. Not every blessing is meant for the present moment. Some answers require preparation, spiritual, emotional, or relational. God often uses the waiting period to prepare the believer to steward what is coming. Without this preparation, even a good answer could become overwhelming or misused. Delay becomes a form of grace, ensuring that when the answer arrives, it is received with wisdom and gratitude. Even prayers that seem unanswered contribute to spiritual awareness. They teach discernment, inviting believers to listen more deeply for guidance rather than focusing solely on results. Over time, the believer begins to recognize God's voice not only in answered prayers, but in redirection, peace, and inner conviction. Prayer transforms from a transaction into communion. What feels like silence is often instruction in disguise. God may be speaking through circumstances, through inner prompting, or through a gradual change of desire. Unanswered prayers are not the end of the conversation. They are part of it. Each prayer offered in faith leaves an imprint on the soul, strengthening trust and shaping purpose. In the fullness of time, many unanswered prayers reveal their meaning. Some answers come differently than expected, others come later, and some come as understanding rather than fulfillment, but none are wasted. Every prayer becomes part of a greater narrative, one where faith is refined, character is formed, and trust is strengthened beyond measure. February is not an ordinary stretch of time measured only by dates on a calendar. It is a divinely appointed season, a moment set apart by God to awaken his people to deeper awareness and intentional devotion. Though it may be shorter than other months, it carries a spiritual weight that cannot be measured by days alone. What makes February significant is not its length, but its assignment. This is a season where God is drawing hearts closer, calling believers to recognize that time itself can be sanctified when it is surrendered to him. In this season, heaven is attentive in a special way, not because God ever stops listening, but because there are moments when spiritual sensitivity increases for those who are willing to slow down and listen. February invites believers to pause, reflect, and realign. It becomes a spiritual doorway where prayer is not routine, but revelatory. Words spoken in faith during this time echo differently, carrying clarity, authority, and purpose. It is a reminder that prayer is not bound by location or circumstance. It is anchored in timing and obedience. Many enter this month carrying the residue of past struggles. The opening weeks of the year may have brought unexpected resistance, delayed answers, or unanswered questions. Yet February stands as a divine interruption, a moment where God whispers that the story is not finished. This season is not about rushing forward to prove progress, but about standing still long enough to receive direction. God often does his deepest work in quiet moments when the soul is still enough to hear instruction rather than demand outcomes. This month also represents an invitation to renewed expectation. God assigns seasons to shift perspectives. February reminds believers that every phase has meaning, even the ones that feel small or overlooked. Just as winter prepares the ground for future growth, this season prepares hearts for what is to come. Prayer offered now is planting seed beneath the surface, unseen but alive, waiting for the appointed time to rise. There is a sacred opportunity in recognizing February as holy ground. When believers approach this season with reverence, they begin to see prayer not as an obligation, but as access. Access to wisdom beyond understanding, access to peace that does not depend on circumstances, access to divine alignment that reorders priorities and restores confidence. God often chooses moments like these to recalibrate faith, strengthening trust not through visible signs, but through inward assurance. February carries the quiet power of preparation. It teaches that not every divine move is loud, and not every breakthrough arrives with immediate evidence. Some seasons are meant to anchor faith, deepen roots, and sharpen spiritual discernment. When this month is embraced with intentional prayer, it becomes more than a transition. It becomes a turning point. In recognizing February as divinely appointed, believers step into alignment with God's timing, trusting that what is unfolding now is laying the foundation for greater revelation ahead. Focused prayer brings clarity to the inner life, touching areas that are often neglected amid daily responsibilities and distractions. When prayer is intentional rather than scattered, it begins to reshape the inner world of the believer. The mind, which is often burdened with anxiety, doubt, and overthinking, finds rest when prayer becomes deliberate. In focused prayer, thoughts are gathered, worries are surrendered, and peace begins to replace mental unrest. This is not an instant escape from pressure, but a steady restoration of calm rooted in trust. Praying for the mind is an act of spiritual stewardship. It acknowledges that peace is not merely the absence of trouble, but the presence of God's assurance. Focused prayer invites divine wisdom into thought patterns, correcting fear-based thinking and renewing perspective. Over time, the mind becomes less reactive and more anchored. Decisions are approached with clarity instead of confusion, and emotional responses are guided by faith rather than impulse. This inner transformation strengthens resilience, enabling the believer to navigate challenges without being overwhelmed. When prayer is focused on the home, unity becomes a central outcome. Homes are shaped not only by physical presence, but by spiritual atmosphere. Intentional prayer invites harmony where tension once existed and understanding where misunderstanding had taken root. Focused prayer for family relationships softens hearts, encourages patience, and restores communication. It creates space for healing conversations and renewed connection. Even when circumstances do not change immediately, Prayer establishes peace that guards the home against division and discouragement. Praying intentionally for purpose brings direction and confidence. Many struggle with uncertainty about their calling, especially during seasons of transition or delay. Focused prayer clarifies purpose not by revealing every step, but by strengthening trust in the journey. It helps believers discern between distraction and direction, aligning actions with divine intent. Through prayer, purpose becomes less about comparison and more about obedience. Confidence grows as clarity replaces confusion and faith steadies the path forward. Focused prayer also fosters spiritual maturity by teaching discipline and attentiveness. It moves prayer from a reactive habit into a proactive practice. Instead of praying only when problems arise, believers learn to pray with intention before challenges unfold. This kind of prayer sharpens discernment and strengthens faith muscles. Over time, the believer becomes more attuned to God's guidance, recognizing subtle direction rather than waiting for dramatic signs. As inner transformation takes place, outward change follows naturally. Peace in the mind influences behavior. Unity in the home strengthens emotional stability. Clarity of purpose fuels perseverance. Focused prayer aligns these areas, creating balance and spiritual depth. It becomes a pathway to maturity, shaping character and nurturing growth. Through intentional prayer, believers are not only sustained, but strengthened, prepared to walk with confidence, wisdom, and unwavering faith. Prayer is far more than a request for answers or relief from difficulty. It is the sacred process through which alignment is restored between the human heart and the divine will. When prayer becomes daily, it shifts from being a reaction to crisis into a relationship built on trust and consistency. In those moments of sincere communication, believers are not simply asking God to change situations, but allowing God to change perspective, posture, and purpose. Alignment happens quietly, often before any outward transformation is visible. Many approach prayer with the expectation that it must immediately fix what is broken around them. Yet the deeper work of prayer happens within. Prayer recalibrates the heart when disappointment has distorted hope. It steadies the mind when confusion threatens peace. Through daily prayer, believers are reminded of their identity, not as victims of circumstance, but as people anchored in divine purpose. When identity is restored, circumstances lose their power to define worth or direction. True alignment in prayer requires honesty. God does not require perfect language or rehearsed words. He responds to authenticity. In daily prayer, believers bring their fears, frustrations, doubts, and gratitude without pretense. This openness creates space for God to shape character, strengthen resilience, and refine motives. Alignment means the heart begins to desire what God desires, not because it is forced, but because it is formed through communion. Prayer also realigns priorities. In a world that constantly demands attention, daily prayer pulls the soul back to what matters most. It teaches believers to seek guidance before action, wisdom before reaction, and surrender before control. Over time, prayer trains the spirit to recognize divine direction. Even in subtle moments, decisions become less impulsive and more discerning because alignment has been restored at the root. One of the most powerful effects of daily prayer is how it reshapes trust. Instead of measuring God's presence by immediate results, believers learn to trust His process. Alignment teaches patience without passivity and faith without anxiety. Even when answers seem delayed, the heart remains anchored is because prayer has already secured confidence in God's faithfulness. The believer begins to understand that silence does not mean absence and delay does not mean denial. As alignment deepens, prayer transforms from a task into a posture. It becomes the lens through which life is interpreted. Challenges are faced with faith instead of fear. Waiting seasons are endured with hope instead of frustration. Prayer aligns the believer not only to receive blessings, but to walk in obedience. And in that alignment, the soul finds rest, not because every question has been answered, but because trust has been restored.